It's February 7th, 1959, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
The US was caught off guard back in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, which many Americans really viewed as being as unexpected and challenging as Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And so in response, President Eisenhower created an agency called DARPA, which was founded on this day in 1958 with a simple mission: to prevent technological surprise.
Yeah, so this is the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. It's now called DARPA. It's the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And you might be picturing sinister scientists and secret labs, but it's actually quite an unusual agency in that its job is basically to find and fund existing projects at other institutions. And they're basically project managers. So it'll actually be a university or a business that's carrying out the research and development. And they observe the project and ultimately decide whether to carry on funding it, whether there's going to be an interesting defence application.
The word defence is quite misleading in this sense, isn't it? I mean, it's defending the nation by creating things that actively kill your opponents. I mean, the grim reality of most of the developments that they've come up with are things that kill people.
But also they've had this remarkable litany of projects that have had very civilian purposes. So, for example, after they'd moved away from space aeronautics and ballistics in the very early days, they began work on projects that ultimately led to the internet, the very thing that we are all communicating via now.
Yeah, it is quite a big one, that one.
Yeah.
Well, a bit less sexily, the computer mouse was also created by Douglas Engelbart with funding from ARPA, as it was at the time.
Why do we not have tributes to Engelbart?
I know, there should be.
We just need like a big concrete mouse somewhere, you know, like a big concrete mouse statue. Although the patent expired. The problem was he was too ahead of his time because nobody had a computer to use one with in the 60s. So by the time they came into widespread use in the 1980s, the patent had expired. So he never made the money that he was probably entitled to.
He also came up with the graphical user interface, which is the way that we interact with computers now with this sort of metaphorical desktop. Of course, his version was much more rudimentary than what we know.
And that was at DARPA as well, was it?
Yep.
Wow, because they also did GPS, didn't they? They had a constellation of 5 DARPA satellites called Transit, operational in 1960 for the US Navy to give them location fixes. So that's why they created it, but now that is the technology whereby I, as a dyspraxic, managed to get from this studio to my house, which is 5 minutes down the road.
Still need GPS to get you there.
Yeah. It's just all the roundabouts look the same, Arion, in suburbia.
Probably slightly less useful to you in suburbia, Olly. But DARPA famously oversaw the development of stealth planes originating in the late 70s, which is a pretty stunning advance in aerial combat.
Killing people, like I said.
Well, stopping people from killing you, you could say, so that you can continue on in your mission to kill other people. But yeah, wiping planes off the radar, something that seemed like, at one point must have seemed like a sci-fi dream, actually became a reality. And we still don't know the exact compounds that are used to pull this off. I mean, obviously, they don't want everyone doing it. But yeah, that was all developed under DARPA as well.
The agency was headed up by a chap called Wernher von Braun. Or to give him his full name, Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun.
I'm getting a vibe that maybe he arrived in the US sometime after 1945, perhaps.
Yeah, they had this operation, which I'd never heard of before, called Operation Paperclip, which I assume was named as boringly as possible so as not to draw attention, because it must have been pretty contentious, where 1,600 German scientists, engineers and technicians went to assist the US military, which makes sense in a way, because after the war, obviously, the Nazis had some pretty impressive military equipment. If the Americans didn't snap them up, then the Soviets would, and in fact the Soviets relocated more than 2,000 German specialists in their own equivalent Operation Osso Aviakim. So the Americans were just taking the best scientists from Germany and incorporating them into their own program secretly. But he wasn't just German. He was like a proper, fully fledged Nazi. So he was the leading figure in the development of rocket technology, helping to design the V2. And it wasn't just a case of like, oh, well, he was one of the great sort of rocket minds of his generation. So, of course, you know, he'd end up being coerced into the war effort for the Nazis. No, he was also a member of the SS. A detail which was classified information, by the way, for some years in the United States.
Well, the satirist Tom Lehrer does this whole bit about Wernher von Braun, and how he has it is, once the rockets go up, Who cares where they come down? That's not my department, said Wernher von Braun.
Yeah, he would go on to say that, he was coerced, he didn't have any choice but to join the Nazi Party, and it didn't involve any political activity.
But you do have a choice to join the SS.
Yeah, I'm like, you've done more damage by working on the Nazi rocket program than a committed Nazi who didn't really do anything would have done. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you can't get out of it by saying, well, my heart wasn't really in it.
He made a film with Disney about the space race because it was his technology that partly powered the Apollo mission.
Wow.
And he was kind of like the all-American face of the space mission. This guy whose designs had killed thousands of people in London, for example, where they were dropping bombs during the Blitz, or contributed to the concentration camp prisoners who were assembling the weapons, having incredibly miserable lives. And he was somehow not only just forgiven, but it was like completely glossed over that was his background. I find it absolutely astonishing now.
And he was pals with Disney.
What are you suggesting?
The other thing with DARPA, and I feel like we've highlighted a lot of their glowing achievements, so it's only fair to say that part of the mission to be advanced even ahead of the cutting edge, and also the fact that DARPA has what's called a freedom to fail culture, where you are encouraged to pursue ideas that might on the surface seem a bit crazy to see if anything good comes from them.
You're encouraged to pursue ideas, but we will withdraw $10 million of funding if they don't work.
Yeah, well, I think that contributes to a lot of it because the agency isn't directly doing the work. They know they're not going to end up being the subject of as many hit pieces that you get in the media, like wacky boffins are studying whether dogs can play chess, that kind of thing. When it's one step removed, they can afford to be a little bit more experimental, and this has resulted in a fair share of missteps. By far the best one is during the Vietnam War, an idea was mooted to create a mechanical elephant that could storm through the dense jungle where US troops were fighting. Apparently, as soon as
Why is that any more far-fetched or ridiculous than a satellite that can tell my phone where I am?
Apparently, the then director of DARPA shut the plan down as soon as he heard that it was even being considered. He was like, no way. And then he took steps to cover up the fact that it had ever been discussed.
I think we all know, really, don't we, that in the future, weaponry is going to look like that. It's going to be robotic in some way, even if it's just a computer virus.
Yeah, one of their more recent publicised failures was Project Eater, which was about developing surveillance robots who could feed and sustain themselves on plant matter. So the idea being you'd stick them up in a jungle or a forest or whatever where you wanted to spy on people, and it wouldn't need a battery or anything like that. It would be powered by grass or leaves or whatever. Anyway, it was shelved in 2015 because there were a lot of concerns about what a self-sustaining robot could be capable of, and it led to a absolutely fantastic press release from Harry Scholl, who is the CEO of the company that was developing it, Cyclone Power Technologies, and he said, "We completely understand the public's concern about futuristic robots feeding on the human population." He added, "But that is not our mission," which only makes me feel like
it's definitely their mission.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of conspiracies that swirl around what DARPA is up to, and one of them, or many of them in fact, are centered on this long-term experiment that was abandoned in 2014 called HAARP, which was short for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. And it was there to, well, if you believe what DARPA says, it was there to study the ionosphere. But if you believe what the conspiracy theorists believe, it was there to do all sorts of things, including control the weather. It's been held responsible for climate change, loads of different natural disasters, including in 2010, the then Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez claimed that HAARP, or a program like it, triggered the Haiti earthquake.
And presumably they're working on a counter to Havana syndrome now, aren't they?
Right.
There's suspicion that the Russians are targeting microwaves at people's brains who work in US embassies, and people can't tell whether it's psychological or it's actual. They were looking at that as far back as the 1950s.
Right.
Another of their less noteworthy projects included investing millions. This was again in the wacky 70s, by far the wackiest decade in DARPA's history, it seems to me. They invested millions in telepathic research to explore the possibility of remote espionage, basically getting people like Uri Geller to spy on people far away somehow. They eventually concluded, as you may be surprised to hear, that was not possible.
I mean, that just shows the incredible influence that Uri Geller had in the 70s, doesn't it? We have to talk about that in another episode. But he's basically a TV personality that got this enormous government agency to research into psychic power because of his BS.
and the limits of bending spoons in your rivals' nations.
Tomorrow.
Meant to be a comedy.
They would really release any old in the 60s.
Oh, man.
Love the show? Support the show. Patreon.com/retrospectors. Part of the Acast Creator Network.